Hi there. In today's study, we start Galatians chapter 3. In the defense of his apostleship, Paul had shown that he received the gospel not through human instruction, but by divine revelation. That's what he showed in the last two chapters. But not only that, but remarkably, even though it was completely by revelation and he didn't get it from anybody else, it was in total agreement with the teaching of the other apostles. Chapter 3 introduces us to the second major point, and that is that law cannot produce faith, but rather worked a curse from which Christ had to redeem mankind. In other words, Paul's gospel would be explained in great detail using different ways of looking at it in both chapter 3 and 4. He started this out with an explanation derived from the experience, or as we call it, the testimony. An explanation derived from experience or testimony. Now, testimony is hard to argue with. That is why it is so important to develop one. Notice in verse 1 of this chapter, he says, "Oh, foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you that you would not obey the truth, before whose eyes?" Before what? Before your eyes. Jesus Christ has been evidently set forth and crucified among you. Now, that's interesting. You see, they were never in Jerusalem 20 some odd years ago when Jesus was crucified. So he must mean more than that. So testimony is hard to argue with. That is why it is so important to develop one. Did you realize that? No one knew this as well as Paul. Paul's testimony included a boyhood in Tarsus, being sent to Jerusalem to learn under Gamaliel, one of the greatest Jewish rabbis of all time. Salvation on the Damascus Road. Sufferings witnessed by none other than some of the Galatian disciples. And most importantly, being the apostle to the nations. That's all part of Paul's testimony. "Oh, foolish Galatians," he says, "who has bewitched you that you would not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ has been evidently set forth, crucified among you." Verse 1 shows that Paul clearly presented oral and written testimony to the Galatians of the crucifixion of our Lord Jesus Christ. He presented it in graphic detail. Not only that, it is certainly apparent that some may have witnessed, and this is it, some may have even witnessed the mighty miracle that occurred in Acts chapter 14, 19, and 20, both in and outside of the Galatian city of Lystra. And I'll read this. There came here, okay? There came there in that Galatian area certain Jews from Antioch and Iconium. Not the Antioch where Paul came from, but that other Antioch, who persuaded the people, and they stoned Paul. And then they drew him out of the city, supposing he had died. But as his body was lying there, the disciples stood around about him. And suddenly, I'm going beyond what the verse says. He rose up, came back into the city, and the next day he departed with Barnabas to Derbe. The disciples that stood round about his body included new Galatian believers. It says disciples. Remember, it was Paul and Barnabas that went up with just a few, but here we have a whole bunch of disciples. There definitely was no clearer illustration of death and resurrection than that. And that also becomes part of a testimony. Recently, I saw someone wear a t-shirt that said in big letters, "Religion sets rules. Jesus sets free." That's exactly what Paul was trying to say to this foolish Galatians. He asked them some very important questions contained in verses 2 to 5. Now, two of these questions I will quote in verses 3 and 5. Are you so foolish? Having begun in the spirit, do you now make yourself perfect in the flesh? Of course not. He then supplying you the Spirit and working miracles in you. Does he do it by the works of law or by the hearing of faith? He was trying to show, look, law does not produce faith. The receiving of the gospel produced changed lives. Can I repeat that? The receiving of the gospel produced changed lives. Does the receiving of law do that? If I tell you, don't do this, you need to do that, does that change your life? Well, obviously not, does it? The gospel, therefore, is received by faith. It's based on the death, burial, and resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. Their testimony included a hard-won faith which involved some suffering. Their testimony included miracles. Miracles should act as a picture frame that focuses attention to the gospel. What did he say? He, therefore, that ministers to you the Spirit and works miracles among you, does he do it by the works of the law or by the hearing of faith? This he Paul was referring to was none other than God. God worked in their lives. That was all part of their testimony. That's it. Our testimony, folks, our testimony cannot be argued against. This is why I keep a journal. And it would be very beneficial for you to do the same thing. To keep a journal of how God has blessed your life. In the last church we were in, we kept a prayer journal. And as we had prayer requests, we wrote them down in the journal. And then before each prayer request, we put a little square. And as these prayers were answered, we would check off the square and go, wow, look at that. God is working in our lives. He's answering those prayers. And Paul showed here that his gospel was evident because of their testimony. Well, you need to keep a journal, because you know what a skeptic's favorite point of logic is this? You know, what you're saying is very good, but, ha, look what happened. There cannot be any kind of argument against it. This happened to me. Try to prove it didn't. Well, see the importance of testimony? And Paul showed that too.